gentlemen, I'd like to start so that we have sufficient drinking time at the end, because the Czech embassy likes to close its doors to drinkers at about 8:30 and can't linger. So, good evening to you all, and welcome to this talk. And I would also like to welcome our speaker, Sir John Tusa, and I would also like to thank the Czech embassy and the ambassador for once again giving us their hospitality here to organise and allowing us to organise yet another event. Before introducing our speaker, I'd just like to draw your attention to two upcoming events. In conjunction with our talk this evening, on Wednesday the 22nd of June, we have a tour to the Bata factory and community at East Tilbury, where Sir John's father was the manager. And on Wednesday the 13th of July, we have our summer outing to the Cotswolds, where we will visit the great houses and gardens of Rowsham and Chastleton. And you'll find details on our website. Now may I introduce Sir John Tusa. I have to say that this is a somewhat daunting task, for he is a very familiar figure to us all, and he is a broadcaster, journalist and author of numerous books in the world of the arts and other subjects, some in joint authorship with his wife Anne. His autobiography, Making a Noise, is highly recommended, and copies are available after this talk, which he has donated to us. So, and they're the last ones he has. So you need to pay a lot of money for them, and that will swell our coffers. And we're very grateful to Sir John for doing that, giving us that injection. And so please, we want to see all of them gone. However, of particular interest to us is Sir John's experience of living in the shadow of a highly organised and somewhat paternalistic community, which was centred around the Bata factory at East Tilbury, itself an offshoot of the great socio-economic industrial complex founded by the Bata family at Zlin in Moravia. Other examples abound in this country, such as that established by the Cadbury family at Bourneville. My own experience of being the product of someone else's social experiment was to be brought up in the benign surroundings of Welwyn Garden City, and I have much to be thankful for, including a sense of what architecture might contribute to an alternative society. However, if the wind was in the east of the town, then the smell of shredded wheat pervaded the town, and I grew up with the smell of shredded wheat drifting across the town under certain conditions, and I can still remember it very well indeed. Similarly, I wonder if the same smell of chocolate were to drift across Bourneville, and indeed whether the smell of leather drifts across, or used to drift across, East Tilbury. We are very, very grateful to you, Sir John, for taking the time to come and address us this evening. So please, will you welcome Sir John Tusa.
Thank you very much, Peter. I should say I stand reproved in that I'm afraid I've always called it the Bata organisation, for actually, I think perhaps an understandable reason. That is, we felt pretty foreign anyway, and to have to go around calling it Bata only emphasised the sense of being foreign. And in 1939-1940, the whole question of identity, were we Czech, were we English, nobody talked about the British much then, was very acute. So I'm afraid I've always called it Bata, just as we anglicised the name Tusa to Tusa. I mean, how do you explain Tusa to the English? Not that Tusa is easy, and by the by, Tusa is a very good, simple Italian name. There are many Tusas in Sicily, and though I don't press that connection too hard, I have a granddaughter who works in Milan at the moment, and she gets on just fine, because everybody knows Rebecca Tusa is of course an Italiana, and they're amazed how well she speaks English. So these are little bits of protective colouring. So I'm afraid it's Bata and it's Tusa, and there you are. But these are little matters of identity. What I propose to do is first of all to read two or three short extracts from the chapter in my book about the experience. Can you hear right at the back? Right. About the experience of coming to England in late 1939 and arriving in this very strange place. However, just a little bit about the home background from Zlin, where we came, and the background of the family. I noted that I was a Bata baby born in a Bata clinic to a Bata man and woman from a Bata house in a Bata town, so the Zlin effect was uppermost. I heard how my father, a talented accountant, very good with numbers, left school at 16, was spotted by the founder, old Thomas Bata, and promoted in his early 20s to manage the Bata tannery at nearby Otrokovice. I heard how my father had to ask the founder's permission to get married. Who was he marrying? Said the founder. Did she come from a good family? Very respectable family from nearby Bistupse Podmostina. Did he have enough money in his company bank account? Apparently. I also learned how the company reserved part of every worker's salary in order to pay for any business losses for which they might be responsible, a practice that continued for many, many years. I learned how Thomas Bata's office was built in a huge lift on the outside of the main building so that he could and did appear on any floor at any time. It exists to this day. How the toilet cubicles in the company buildings were made extra narrow so that no one would linger there. That was true of the buildings in East Tilbury as well. How Thomas Bata fatally ordered the pilot of his private plane to take off in thick fog and was killed in the crash that followed minutes later. So that is where I came from, very, very Bata. As we got out of Czechoslovakia, got to England, and what did we find? What did we find? No hills, no pine forests, no rich meadows, no character, no personality, just flat, featureless fields. We were in the British Bata community at East Tilbury. And what did we find there? Nothing very strange, nothing new, but a reincarnation of mothership of Bata Zlin, down to the last detail. Identical rectangular factory blocks, identical workers and managers' square houses, identical social and sporting amenities of the enlightened 1930s kind, instead of the lush surroundings of the Hostine Heights cradling the shoemakers' community in Zlin. There was only the flat, featureless, desolate marshes that line the north bank of the Thames estuary. We had left Zlin, Moravia, and ended up in Proto-Zlin, Essex. The full humour of it only dawned on me many years later, but you can't see the joke when you are 3. But we were lucky. Lucky to be in England, lucky to be employed, lucky to be in a friendly Czech community. Other complications followed, however. Just a little bit about the atmosphere of Bata East Tilbury. It always represented a massive disruption, an intrusion of Central European modernism, Central European paternalism, Central European radicalism into the impoverished flatlands, for they were, of southeast Essex. Here, a few dozen Czech managers, speaking with a funny accent in broken English, applying a Czech system of making and working, organised, ran and managed a workforce of up to 3,000 English workers. If the English thought it was all a bit odd, they also appreciated good jobs in an area otherwise very short of them. This was valued even if the source of the new prosperity was what people called, in a very perfectly friendly way, bloody foreigners. For them it was not a judgment, still less a rejection, just a description. And a little bit about the environment, the actual physical environment of the houses, of actually where we lived. We lived on the Bata estate for about a year or so before moving out to a nearby village. At East Tilbury, there were no cottages, no crooked lanes, no pub, no church, no variety, nothing that showed signs of age. The houses were stuccoed, some fronted in red brick, flat-roofed, uniformly spaced along straight streets. The estate lacked surprise, the unexpected. The two basic types of house were modelled on those found in Zlin, the basic box, the majority, and the extended managerial, which boasted a first-floor balcony. Designed to offer respite from Central Europe's stifling summers, in the more temperate climate of East Tilbury, the balconies seemed forlorn and pointless and saw little use. The characteristic flat roofs of these Bata dwellings seemed hilariously unsuitable faced with English winter rain. And what were they like inside? Foreignness erupted in the furnishings of the Czech houses. Almost universal was the long wooden integrated sideboard, glossily walnut veneered, with cupboards for storage, shelves for books, curved doors, and cabinets with sliding glass doors to display treasured objects. Bohemian cut glass vases, cigarette ashtrays, and sweet boxes were dotted around in profusion, along with crystal bowls filled with hand-painted Easter eggs, the prevailing style, a bourgeois version of folk-inspired art. My sister Vicky recalls ruby-eyed glass and figurines of devils chasing young girls. My brother George recalls bulky armchairs with rounded wooden arms. I remember an ashtray with a hand-carved bear looming at one side. Hardly a plate existed that wasn't painted in cheerful, folksy, floral patterns. So that's just a few personal insights into the world that we came into pretty late, just in time, in 1939. Now, what it was suggested that I should say rather more about was Bata and the Bata factory and their approach to business. Because it was a very successful firm, still is, in many respects. It was very professional, it was very thorough, and I think people sometimes don't quite understand what the significance of the mass production of leather shoes was. Instead of the cobbler with a last building the shoe himself, layer by layer, outers, uppers, soles, heels, etc., etc. Each one of these processes, it wasn't a process, each one of these actions was stripped down into one action on a moving conveyor belt. So I suppose there must have been, roughly, if I remember, 24 actions, 24 stages of building up a leather shoe from the bare last, and then the textile, and then the upper, and all that, to the final shoe. And the production line was controlled, and each person had just so much time to put on, let's say, the upper, and then the conveyor belt would move on. This was, I don't think anybody had thought of making shoes like this. So mass production is a term that we use rather glibly, but that was really, really revolutionary. And I'm sure, or I suspect, that this is what allowed old Thomas Bata and his successors to produce good quality shoes at a very, very affordable price. They were also very early into computers. And my father was sent over to the United States immediately after the war to buy the latest computers for running the company. I'm not quite sure what particular bit of the company computers were used for, but Bata knew that they had to have that sort of thing. They had to be up to date with the latest machinery and the latest equipment. It was also early into the use of objectives. Everybody uses objectives now. Bata used them from a very, very early stage, and the objectives were a key part of quality control. Quality control sounds a rather daunting activity, and so in many respects it was. But there was a human side to it. That is that quality control in the Bata organization was often practiced, and the phrase used was playing hell. So on the one hand, you had objectives and quality. On the other hand, if the quality wasn't good enough, there was a very big row indeed. My father's predecessor, a man called Victor Schmidt, was particularly famous for this. On the first floor of the administration block at East Tilbury, there was the sample room. I loved the sample room because there was every kind of shoe that was being made or that was being proposed. There was the shoe, then there was a list, how many had been made, how many had been sold, and so on and so forth. And I just loved going round the sheer variety, seeing the shoes that were made and the ones that had been designed, and then nothing came of them. And once a week, under Victor Schmidt, everybody would gather, and Schmidt would go round and he would look at the samples, what was being made, what was proposed, and would then play hell. Usually by picking up a shoe and throwing it at whoever he thought was responsible. The smarter people knew that during this whole process they should stay quite a long way away from Victor Schmidt. I don't think he ever hit anybody directly, but there were shoes flying around. And I must say, somehow the notion of playing hell, my father would have come back from various meetings, and my mother would say, "What is it like at work today, dear?" or words to that effect in Czech. And he would reply, "I had to play hell about something." Whether this was good for anybody's health, I really don't know. But it was certainly a shorthand, more than a shorthand, for how do you maintain control, because it really did matter. Now, one of the ways in which quality control was maintained and objectives were checked was in the Friday luncheon conference. It was always called the Friday luncheon conference because, being foreigners, they wanted to speak the language properly, and luncheon was luncheon. And all the senior managers and departmental managers would gather, and they would have to answer for what their department had done in the previous week. What are the targets? What had they achieved? Why hadn't they achieved them? Or if they had achieved them, fine. And above all, if they hadn't achieved them, then they had to have a very good explanation. And if they didn't have a good explanation, then playing hell followed. How my father, or any of them, put up with this at a lunch meeting, I really don't know. I would have thought it must have been ulcer inducing, and perhaps it was, for all I know. But as a serious way of doing business, I can see that it wasn't just that. But as a sort of human way of conducting business, well, it's not up to me to judge it. I think it worked, and I suspect that everybody who worked there understood that that was the way in which the organisation did work. But I can hardly say the words Friday luncheon conference without a slightly sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, knowing that my father would be coming back in the evening and would announce that he'd had to play hell over something or other. He was a very gentle man in many respects, but this was also the Bata way of working. And there were many benign aspects to it. After all, this was a highly paternalist place. As I said, there was a sports field, there was a cinema, there was a farm, there was a swimming pool, there were tennis courts, there were shops, there was a restaurant, there was a cafe. These were all Bata. And this was because that was what it was assumed that a good employer did in the 1930s, 1940s. People are going to look on it now and say that this is all paternalistic and oppressive, etc., etc. Yes, no doubt, you wouldn't do it now. You would have, but it was done, and it wasn't done, and it was done for decent reasons. And by the quality of the housing was extremely good as well. And one of the ways in which the welfare of staff was looked after was in the annual sports day. Now, even if you could imagine in an organisation of 3,000 today, if somebody suggested that you should organise a sports day, I think this would be greeted with a degree of bafflement. But, and there are good quality films about a sports day. Most of the films, if anybody was ever interested, are kept in the East Anglian Film Archive at the University of Essex. So there's a great, it is a treasure trove of life and work in the 40s and 50s. And you come to sports day. And it's not just that there was one heat of the 100 yards for the men. There were several. Now, the chances of finding 10 people in any organisation of any size who would be prepared to run 100 metres at a sports day today, I think is simply impossible. But there were several. Ditto with the women. And people did the high jump. And by the by, because the films that I'm thinking of were probably in the 40s, late 40s, everybody was slim. Why? Because of wartime rationing. Slim and fit. So it's a social document. I say nothing as to whether this is good, bad, or indifferent, though actually people were very healthy. But there could be a sports day because people were sufficiently fit to do it. And it was a good family occasion. And another way in which the company could show that it was looking after staff. And I don't recall ever, though there may be, there are lots of people who didn't want to attend it at all. It's neither here nor there. I don't recall anybody ever protesting and saying they weren't going to take part in a sports day because it was run by the management and organised by the bosses or anything like that. So sports day was was a good and a fun day. Competition, though, came back in particular in the period up to Christmas. Obviously, you had to make and sell a lot of shoes in the November, December period. And so in maybe 6 to 8 weeks running up to Christmas, the company ran something called the Christmas Quality Competition. And every department had to compete against the others. And there was one set of competition was for the leather factory, all the people making leather shoes, one for rubber, one for textiles and subsidiaries, and maybe some of the service departments had a competition as well. And every week, the performance of those departments were announced and were published in the Bata record, and the respective performance of each company, of each division, each department, was published in the Bata record with who was top of the division, as if this was the first or second or third division of the football league. And so who went up, who went down, this was measured, mattered, it was published, and people knew whether their department was doing better or worse, or whether they were lagging at the bottom because the quality wasn't good enough. And there was a reward at the end of this. There was a dinner for all the staff of the winning workshops. So that was a dinner for several hundred. So whoever won in rubber, leather, subsidiaries, etc., were given a very good Christmas dinner, complete with entertainers. So there was a reward, and the impression I get was that there was a recognition as well that this was something that mattered, and that you actually wanted your department to win. You wanted, and there were little cut-out figures on the back of the Bata record. So the foreman would then be fitted in with a football jersey and shorts. So everything making it look as if it was like a football competition. But at the end of it, whoever had won. There was the dinner for each winning workshop, and then a big staff dinner for not just all the people who'd won in the winning workshops, but all the people who you would expect to come together for a great company jamboree over Christmas at the end. And by the by, the quality of the entertainment, I mean, I remember going to these dinners. I remember going to one where the performers were two opera singers from what was then Sadler's Wells Opera. I knew their name, and I thought it was rather impressive that they were singing. Now, what were they doing? They were doing what performers had done through the ages and what they'll continue to do. They were earning a few £100 from doing something on the side. But I think it's a little indication of the quality of the entertainment that was provided. This was the company at its paternalistic best. And by the by the time if you worked for 25 years in the company, you got a gold watch, a gold Rolex Oyster. I still have my father's gold Rolex Oyster with an inscription on the back, and then a facsimile of the signature of Thomas Bata. And lots of them, I say lots, quite a number were given out every year. So long service was valued. As I said, this was one of the very positive sides of the paternalism. There's paternalism which was interested in and devoted to good production and productivity. The oddest bit of the Christmas period, well, there were several odd ones. first one that about 3 days before Christmas, my father and his senior managers met in the company flat at the top of what was probably still then called Community House, a very Czech name, of course, now the Bata Hotel. And they gave one another Christmas presents. And they weren't a pair of socks or something like that. I mean, they were really good Christmas presents. The question I always wanted to ask was, were they really Christmas presents? Them to them, from my father to them, from them to my father. Was it somehow massaged as part of expenditure? Or if they really were Christmas presents, my goodness, they were generous. But I never dared to ask, who is paying for these presents? I just took them as part of life, part of the world. And then came Christmas Eve, and you'd hardly say the feast celebrated by Czechs. And one of the guests at our house was always a man called Norman Dover, who was the head of retail sales. And about halfway through, maybe slightly more through dinner, maybe just after the turkey, the phone would ring in the corridor outside the dining room. Norman would get up. Nobody else bothered. They knew what the phone call was. He went out. There was then a pause of a few minutes, and he'd then come back holding a piece of paper, and he would then read out the financial results for the crucial last 2 weeks before Christmas. And everybody would then say, thank God it has been a good Christmas, now we can cheer. And I mean, I saw this for so long that it was a treasured and a precious part of Christmas. I also thought it was very pagan. Then I thought it's no more pagan than harvest Thanksgiving. The harvest has come in, it's been a good harvest, thank you very much. On this occasion, the Lord has given us good retail sales in the fortnight up to Christmas, and we are very, very grateful. Anybody then could continue and have a very enjoyable Christmas Eve. But I can't imagine, I mean, there may be other companies which also celebrate their retail sales performance or wholesale sales performance in the fortnight before Easter, before Christmas, and give thanks to it on Christmas Eve, but not very many. Christmas Eve, and then 2 days later, the last of the ceremonies, so to say, Boxing Day. On Boxing Day, my parents always invited the entire Czech community from East Tilbury to come to the house for drinks and a sing-song. And it began at 11:30 in the morning. By 11:20, the road outside was absolutely lined. Everybody had arrived. You know, if you're invited for 11:30, you arrive at 11:30. So everybody was in by 11:30. The drinks started. The men mainly stood around, and after about 30 or 40 minutes, having shifted on their feet a bit, somebody said or made it clear it was time to sing. So they moved to the next door room, which was fairly large. Song sheets were brought out with words which they probably didn't need to use, and then the party really got going. They didn't need a piano, they didn't need a recorder, they sang in, as far as I could hear, I'm pretty sure, perfect 3/4 part harmony, men only, singing the old songs that they used to sing in the Sokol movement in the old days. I always thought, and I think still, that was probably the certainly one of the happiest days of the year for everybody, because they were singing in Czech, they were the Czech community, they were singing the songs which they had known and loved, and it was a terrific piece of bonding. It wasn't anything directly to do with the company, but of course it was, because they all worked for the company, and they wouldn't have been there if they hadn't worked for the company. So, as you can see, these are the rituals, and they were rituals. They were very regular. That made up my life, my family's life, and the life of this rather strange, or perhaps it wasn't strange, Czech community in a remote corner of southeast Essex, where otherwise they would have felt a very, very long way away from the heartland, the homeland. Not that I think that any of them missed it. You know, they knew what they'd left. They knew what the life of communism was. They knew what their families had to put up with. But nevertheless, the identity and the sense of identity was kept alive through these sort of activities and rituals. Some organised by the company, some organised by the people themselves. So that is a little picture of the Bata organisation, the Bata company, at work and at play. And when those of you go, if you don't know it already, next week, you will see the place absolutely recognisable and little changed from what it was 70 years ago. That was Bata, that was Zlin on Thames.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I wasn't quite sure what was coming actually, so we all kept very silent and quiet. I'm sure that Sir John will take questions, but I was just going to say, I'm going back right to the beginning actually, and the problem of crossing over from a craft industry to mass production and keeping quality control, or in fact quality control changes when you go from the handcrafted to the mass produced, and it's something that was sort of uppermost in, well, partly I would say, partly behind what William Morris was trying to achieve with the sort of promotion of handcrafts in the middle of the 19th century, trying to get back the sense of achievement in craftsmanship, which was being eroded by mass production. And I think what's interesting about what Sir John has said is that the Bata way of doing things, and the sort of, dare I say, paternalistic way of doing it, the way they sort of engage themselves with their workforce, sort of compensated for this loss of sort of, as it were, craftsmanship, because they nevertheless, the workforce obviously, I would have thought, gained a lot of satisfaction out of what they were doing, although it was very sort of repetitive. And I just find that sort of dynamic really, really quite interesting. The other thought, I was just wondering if the Czech fraternity at East Tilbury spent the, was it Christmas Eve, or New Year's Eve, drinking and singing Sokol songs. You wondered what the Cadburys were doing in Birmingham. Anyhow, if there are any questions, please can we have them? Sorry, can I? Sorry, let's speak first.
Yes, I'm very interested in your education. You obviously spoke Czech at home, and what about the employees, the Czech employees? Was there Czech education for their children?
So was there Czech?
Education.
No, and we didn't speak Czech at home.
Oh,
My parents, in the early months, did, and apparently I, aged 3 and a bit, maybe 4, told my mother not to speak to me in that language in front of my friends. So, you know, that's how early the sense of, what you want to call it, otherness comes about. She observed that. My father took a more pragmatic view. He thought this family is going to be brought up in this country, so they'd better speak English full time. Now, as we know, in this day and age, you don't have to make those sort of choices, but they felt those were the choices. But so there was only one language, and however oddly the Czechs spoke English, they could speak perfectly well, just with a heavy accent. And my father spoke, so to say, perfect English, rather correct English, but always with an accent to his dying day. My mother had rather colourful, almost malapropisms. She said she would go up to Bond Street once a week to the Elizabeth Arden shop for beauty treatment. And she said, I'm going up to Elizabeth Arden to be rejuveniled. I think it's charming. I think of it as being rejuveniled to this day. I wish it were. But if I say, Peter, were you brought up speaking Czech at home?
No.
No.
No. I mean, I'll make some comments if you'd like, John, because
Well, sorry.
Yes, please do.
my father worked for Bata all his career and came to the UK in about 1935 and lived on the Bata estate, and my mother joined him in 1938, and I was born in 39 and lived on the estate for 10 months. Now I have no recollection of that because we then had to leave because my father or my parents were actually Sudeten Germans, which was unusual because there were very few Sudeten Germans working for Bata, which was almost entirely Czech. But anyway, so my father had worked on the international side. He'd studied abroad. He spoke German, French, English, and so on. So he was sent here when they expanded into the UK. So it was an interesting time. I was interested in your description of the various rituals, which brought back a number of memories, I must say, from our family, particularly the playing hell, dare I say. But we then went to Scotland in 1947 when Bata took over a Scottish shoe retailer and wholesaler. And so my father was a little bit at arm's length from, I'm afraid we still call it, he was always Mr. Tusa to us, I'm afraid. So he was at arm's length at least from John Tusa, and his, he was a pretty tough guy, as you know, and it was a tough organisation. And certainly the points you made about employees having to pick up costs, for instance. I mean, my father was handling a lot of retail shops in Scotland, and if there were any shortages discovered, who do you think had to pay for them? Wasn't paid for by the firm. So it was an interesting experience, but I didn't know the estate well. I mean, I've obviously visited. I do recall at the end of the Second World War, I think it must have been after the victory in Japan, there was a celebration there with a huge bonfire and so on down at the estate. I don't know whether you remember that one, John, or whether you were there, but it was certainly an interesting time. But the paternalism went so far, I think it's fair to say, John, because I remember, as you say, the very generous presents that were given and so on, and that was very good. But pension arrangements left something to be desired, I have to admit. I think they paid well and expected people to save themselves and provide, but when it came to actually what pension my father had later and what was left to my mother, I'm afraid it worked out as pennies. Whereas today, of course, things are rather different. But it was a fascinating company. I used to read the Bata record every week. I think it came out, and so one kept in touch that way with what was happening. And it was fascinating to hear your recollections of what was happening there.
One question here, sorry.
I had the pleasure of going to an open day there about 3 years ago. It was a really nice day. But there were several people there who'd worked in the factory. And they said the working day started with the sound of a siren. Is that correct?
I wouldn't be at all surprised.
And it was quite strict about, you know,
Yes.
if you were late, you were very, you know, it was very paternalism, but very, very strict at the beginning of the day, you were talking about.
Yes, and you know, people would clock in. Not just there. I mean, this was pretty common, and there were, as if you are going through any sort of modern barrier now, and you had your card, and in it went, and it recorded what time you clocked in. And if you were due to be there at 7:30, and it showed at 7:35, I don't know what actually happened, but at least it was there on record. So there may well have been a siren. I wasn't there. Actually, yes, and probably there was a siren at 12:30 for lunch, and one again to make sure that work had started again in the afternoon.
Interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, another question here.
Yes, could I just say that as one of the guides at East Tilbury, if you come on the trip next month, all this about the clocking in and off, on and off, and all these things will be revealed and confirmed. I couldn't list that up advertising there. The other thing is, if you're coming down on the train, the C2C rail carriages are in groups of 4. You can get into the front 4, you won't have such a long walk when you get to East Tilbury. Plus the fact that I will be able to get on the train and join you in the first 4 coaches, so that we sort of get together before you actually get off the train at East Tilbury. Right, thank you, Sir John.
My grandfather was one of the directors of Bata and knew your father, so he was called Hinek Bata. And
Yes,
I know my mother remembers your parents, so
Yeah, oh,
she would have liked
thank
to
you.
come today, but she
Yes,
wasn't able
very
to come.
familiar name. Yeah.
But so I was very young when my grandfather died, but my mother's memories are less of, you know, Bata as a industrial operation, but she did tell quite funny stories about the Czechness basically of Bata internationally. And my grandfather, he came to England in 1948, they escaped. So when he came, he ended up being someone who travelled all around the world sorting out the production issues in a lot of the factories internationally. So he went everywhere. And he said the one thing was he longed to sort of try all the local, you know, food and cultural experience of those countries. And it literally was everywhere in Asia, Africa, South America he went. But he said the Czechs had always trained their cooks to cook Czech food. And every night he would be eating the same food because he'd go around eating plenty and all of that. He'd be having all those repeat meals. So it remained very, very Czech throughout the 50s and even early 60s. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, my question perhaps follows on a bit from that and about your grandfather. You were saying about your father giving hell to people. Was there somebody further up in the international organisation who would give your father hell?
Yes, there was the, as it were, the central Bata headquarters in Batawa in Canada. By the way, I always thought that the main island in Indonesia, which is Batavia, was actually a Bata offshoot. But you know, everywhere else, Bata Nagar, etc. These were all Bata places, so why not Batavia? Sorry, what was your question?
It was about who gave your father hell. Or
Oh, I see, yes. So the Central Bata organisation in Batawa, and they behaved as any sort of centralised part of a large global organisation had to behave. They tried to establish common standards and centralise and this, that and the other. And my father absolutely hated it. And I sometimes wondered that when I was at the BBC, and I hated the BBC Board of Governors, whether actually I was just replaying what my father felt for the Central Bata organisation. I think I may have been, but his view and his colleagues was, we're doing a very good job here. Why are these people who don't know the circumstances in which we are working, why are they trying to impose what my father and his colleagues would regard as an alien form of centralisation? And that gave him a lot of grief. A lot of grief. And he survived, but yeah. So yes, nobody came out of it scot-free.
I'd like to come back to the lady's first question, which also related to your education. Were you educated on the site, and were there lots of other Czech children there, or did you get sent off to the village primary school down the road?
I was sent off to the village primary school. By that stage, we'd moved to a nearby village called Hornton on the Hill, where there was a primary school with, whatever, 4 or 5 classrooms. And I stayed there, for 2 to 3 years. And then my parents sent me to a boarding school in South Devon, in a place called Ashburton, because when they asked around, they said, how do you educate children in this country of yours? And I said, well, you send them to a boarding school. and they said, what do you mean you send them away from home? Yes, of course, of course. And for a variety of reasons, they found it was actually a Cambridge school which was evacuated to Ashburton in South Devon. So at the age of 6.5, sound of violins and tragedy, I was sent off at boarding school in South Devon, and I never returned home. In the sense, I went from boarding school there to boarding school, public school, to national service, to university, to marriage. So I left home at 6.5. But there you are. But it began in the local school. But it was assumed that everybody, and I think our generation, Peter, I don't think any of us, I mean the children, thought that not having an English education would be a good idea. I mean, that business of don't talk that language to me, that sense of we're in this country, that's a bit foreign, don't emphasize it. So at least the education was a way of turning us into nice little Englishmen.
What market was Bata aiming for and attaining as compared with, say, Clark's, which also had a company town that it created?
What sort of market was there for?
Yes.
What, its shoes?
Yes, in shoes. What sort of, well, you must have aimed at getting a particular type of person buying shoes or whatever.
Oh, it was the mass market, and the market which hadn't, I think, previously had good quality shoes at an affordable price made for them. So it certainly wasn't fashion. I mean, people like Dolcis, Lillian Skinner, people like that, they made the fashion shoes. Bar Freeman Hardy and Willis, perhaps. Bata were probably a rather new mass market of decent shoes of reasonable design at an affordable price. I mean, there was a real, after all, Thomas Bata said, shoemakers to the world. And he really believed that. He believed in putting shoes on the feet of people who otherwise didn't have them. Well, that wasn't the case in England, but it was the case that these were affordable shoes and of a decent quality, of a kind which may not have been affordable before. Maybe, you know, that ran from 1930 to, I don't know why it failed actually, but that's not the question. And at all events, Bata failed to come to terms with cheap international imports and with mass-produced canvas and rubber shoes. And they were probably still making leather shoes on lasts at a time when everybody else was making the then equivalent of trainers.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I understand that Bata also had a factories in Lancashire, in Maryfield, because when the brother of the original owner reached 90, I went on a coach trip with the employee and relatives of the employee to Holland to start with, in Best, where they still make the agriculture and touristic footwear. And then we continued because English people who worked for Bata wanted to know where it all started. And we went to Zlín to stay in that hotel which still called Moskva. We have seen the house where Bata lived, and because during the communist regime some of the buildings were used for the House of Pionieru, the communist children's organization, or they also, lots of these buildings were devastated. There is a museum of shoes in Zlín, and it was very interesting for, so how was it that the people in Maryfield?
Maryport? Sorry?
No, it was in Lancashire.
Yes,
The
Maryport
group of people on the coach were from Lancashire, and another group from Tilbury.
Yeah.
And because the brother of the original owner reached 90, we went to meet our president Václav Havel, and I was there as a capacity interpreter to help them with language people visited in Zlín.
I have two questions, if I may. One is, have you any idea for how many years Bata sent Czech children in London and perhaps elsewhere Bata shoes for Svatý Mikuláš?
That I didn't know.
Yeah. And every Christmas, every Svatý Mikuláš at the what's now the Czech and Slovak house in West End Lane. And they were always black. Except for my friend down there who 1 year had a pair of red shoes. She didn't say so.
Tears charged. My mother happened to be a teacher in the Saturday Czech school, so I think they thought it was favouritism, but I'm sure it was my foot size. But they were usually brown or black, weren't they?
Yes. Yeah, but came in very handy to poor Czechs in Britain in the early 1950s. And speaking of Czechs, may I ask how your father reacted and how you reacted when you became Sir as a Czech person?
Do you know, I'm trying to, I think he died by then.
I wondered, I'm sorry
He died by then, but he got an OBE for the work that Bata did during the 1953 floods. And you know, there was a lot of welfare work was done, and he was hugely proud of that, as I am proud. But he died by then.
Caroline.
I wanted to ask a factual question really. When did the factory actually close down?
Can you help with that? When did the factory close down? When did it stop making shoes?
2005, I think, or 5, 6. The last production line was shipped out to Kuala Lumpur, and one of our guys, another Mike, he was the engineer that went out and set it up there and showed the local Malays and Chinese that the green button started it and the red button stopped it. And then he came back, and he was the last one to actually go to the desk in the old maintenance department. And it was a question of, will the last one of these switch out the lights? And that was it. It was all shut.
Well, I think we've, sorry, one last question.
No, John, I was just interested. Did your father come to East Tilbury from managing a tannery, or had he got
Yes.
some other steps straight in between?
There was a tannery which Bata owned in Leicester. That's what you're saying.
No, sorry.
Did he?
You said that your
His
father
own
had
steps.
been picked out
Yeah.
and given a job to manage a tannery in Years
Yes.
And I just wondered what other other experience he'd had before he took over the very large operation in East Tilbury.
I'm not aware that he had a senior management role as such. So he was known to be good with numbers. He was a bright young accountant, and if he could manage the tannery, it was a young organisation. And young organisations are run by young people. And Thomas Bata said, he's bright. I was going to say she's bright. He had never said that, because that was the world. And he gave the young people responsibility. That's why young organisations work.
Could I please just mention that there was also a lot of war effort that Bata took part in, and produced boots for the British Army and things like that during World War II, which I think is worth mentioning.
Oh, if it hadn't been for the wartime contracts of army boots, protective wear, Wellingtons and so on, I think the company would have gone under. But then at the same time, Zlin was making shoes for the Wehrmacht. And after that, it was making shoes for the Red Army. And by the by, if you haven't read Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, that is set in Bhatanagar. I mean, the hero is the son of a Bata family in India, and Vikram Seth captures the the oddness. I mean, God knows it is strange for the Czechs to be in England, but for the Czechs to be in India, eating dumplings and things like that. So, very, very touching. Anyway, A Suitable Boy, Vikram Seth, that captures the Bata experience.
Thank you very much indeed. I think this has been marvellous talk, and we very much appreciate it. And please join me in. Please come and buy some books. They all must go. Thank you very much.